My guest this week is Thomas Noble, who is available with a translation of several Carolingian chroniclers in a book called Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, which I'm holding up here. And Louis the Pious is, of course, going to be our main focus on this episode. But before we begin, I want to begin to talk about how this book came about and how the sources that you used and the chroniclers in for this book and their point of view on Carolingian history and the Carolingian writers in the book.
Well, I taught both for undergraduates and for research students, graduate students, Carolingian history for 40 years. And certain texts were very important. And a number of these just really were not available. Now, there were lots of translations of Einhard's Vita Caroli, so that was not really an issue. Although everyone used the old Penguin translation, which I think was not very good. And then there was an old translation of Notker that, again, I don't think was really very good. And there's also one of Notker that's online that's very old and very antiquated in its language. But for some period of time, I used those because that's what was available. My students, my graduate students, could mostly read Latin, but my undergraduates couldn't read Latin. And when one moved into the 9th century, there was a translation prepared by a woman, Donna Boutel, that was then published in an anthology of Carolingian texts. But I don't think it was actually a very good translation. And it wasn't necessarily widely available. And you had to buy that whole book just to get that text. There was a translation of the so-called Astronomer done by Alan Cabinus, but the Astronomer's Latin is actually pretty difficult. And in lots of places, Cabinus simply paraphrased. He didn't really translate. So over a period of a good many years, I sort of built up translations of my own that I used in my classes. And that gave me the opportunity to ask students to reflect on them, to comment on them, to tell me what they liked, what they didn't like. And little by little, I sort of built up the references that attached to the text in the book. And I would ask the students, well, what would be helpful here? Or do you know who this is? Do you know what that means? And when students were not clear about these things, then boom, I made a note to explain who a person was or what a technical term might mean. And so, little by little, I sort of built up this collection of materials, and then I sent it off to be published. So it's there's nothing really terribly mysterious about it, but I would say it was a project that was probably a good, I don't know, 10 years or more in the making. So
I've been relieved to finally publish the final result then after so many years.
Well, yes, it was very good to see it, and I think the book has been pretty well received. It sells at a kind of a steady rate every year. It certainly doesn't make me rich, but it sells a few copies, and it didn't get very many reviews, but translations almost never get reviews. What there were positive. And so I was pleased with that. But essentially, I prepared the book, to be useful, to pull these 5 texts together in one place, to have them translated by one person, and to have them available, at a reasonable price. The book was issued in both hardback and paperback, and the paperback version is not terribly expensive. I mean, as you know, publishers nowadays tend to charge outrageous prices for books, but the paperback version of this book is not too bad. And I know that a good many teachers out there use it, so that means it's meeting the intention I had for it, just to be useful and have these texts get into students' hands.
You mentioned Einhard, of course, is one of the most famous Charlemagne's biographers, and you mentioned Astronomer as well, who was personally one of my favorite biographers on Louis the Pious when I read the book. So let's talk about, as I said, our focus is Louis the Pious in the episode, and I did one episode on Charlemagne a year ago with the brilliant Stuart Airlyle, whose book also is fantastic read about Carolingian history, but. Let's talk about some of the sources for Louis the Pious, and one of them is, of course, the Astronomer as well. So, how reliable are these sources that you use for this book?
Well, I mean, that's a wonderful question, and actually, uh, it's several questions all wrapped up together. Reliable can mean, on the one hand, how accurate is it, just in
Mm.
terms of its factual details, how accurate. Reliable can mean how faithful is it to the point of view of this anonymous author, the astronomer. Um, no text is ever antiseptic. I mean,
Mm.
is ever pure. Um, Authors write for reasons. They have
And
things.
even today,
Well, sure, of course. So, uh, I mean, I think that I mean we're very grateful to have the astronomer's text because I mean, as you know, you've read them. Uh,
mm,
Hermolda stops in the year 826, and Thegan only a little bit later than that. So Louis lived until 840. So the astronomer gives us the entire course of Louis's life, and beyond that, he provides a lot of detailed information about the years when Louis was king of Aquitaine before he became emperor in 814. And we're very grateful to have that. Um, Now, some of that kind of material can be corroborated, for example, with different annals, the Royal Frankish Annals and the so-called Revised Annals. And then there are a number of annals that were produced in the south of France that are more or less complete or cover particular stretches of years. But we can use some of those texts to sort of flesh out the account or to verify certain details, certain dates. Um, but on the whole, I think that uh, I think that the astronomer's text is pretty accurate. Um, Now you could say uh, pretty accurate as to details, but then you could say, well, does he have a point of view? And I think he does. He doesn't like Lothar very much,
mm,
for example. Um, and what's interesting there is that we have a number of chronicles and annals and so forth that are written in the ninth century, and Lothar actually never got a defender.
mm.
Nobody ever took his point of view, um, which I
Poor
think is.
Lothar.
I'm sorry.
Poor Lothar.
Yeah, so in a way you could say, well, if these authors are sort of very negative about Lothar, is that inaccurate, or is that simply arguing a particular point of view that sees him as kind of a dangerous figure, a disloyal figure? Um, you know, you can understand that in a number of different ways. I mean, Nithard, for example, who produces a chronicle that covers most of the reign of Louis the Pious and then goes into the reign of Charles the Bald, goes really down to um, the great battles in the early 840s. Nithard doesn't like Lothar either, and uh, so it's anyway. I mean,
They
those are
might
the
be
kind of
onto something then.
what's
That it
that?
wasn't a very. They might be onto something. He wasn't a very likable figure. It seems like.
Well, I think that's probably true, although there have been some scholars in recent times. A Cambridge PhD student, Elena Screen, who was a student of Rosamund McKitterick's, has written quite a bit about Lothar and has kind of tried to rehabilitate him.
Mm.
And he was, if you look for a moment at the situation through Lothar's eyes, um, when Charles Martel died in 741, he had two sons. Shortly after this, Carloman, one of those sons, entered a monastery. So Pippin the Third, was left alone. When he died in 768, he leaves Charlemagne and Charlemagne's brother. 3 years later, Charlemagne's brother dies. So basically, you'd had unitary succession in the Carolingian world. Now, in many ways, that was kind of an accident, but that's what happened. So then Charlemagne comes along, and he has he has lots of children, but he has three legitimate sons, uh, and two of them died before Louis did. So there's again a unitary succession in 814. Louis succeeds by himself. Now, Louis has sons, Pippin, Lothar, and Louis. And then his first wife dies. He marries Judith of Bavaria. She has a son, Charles. So all of Louis's sons from the first wife have some level of concern because Louis is going to try to carve out some territory for Charles, for his son, whom we'll eventually know as Charles the Bald. Meanwhile, Lothar is, by the Ordinatio Imperii in 817, and I'll just parenthetically mention that we have a lot of capitulary evidence for the reign of Louis the Pious. We have a lot for Charlemagne's reign too. Capitularies are something like executive orders. They're something like writs. They're something like legislation. Scholars tie themselves up in knots trying to decide exactly what these documents are. But the point is there's quite a bit of this material, and it also helps us, as, for example, do the records of church councils. There were a great many church councils in the reign of Louis the Pious, and we have the records of those councils. So these help us to flesh out the picture given to us by the biographies. Well, anyway, back to Lothar. The Ordinatio Imperii basically said that Lothar was to succeed as emperor, and his younger brothers, at that point, it was Pippin and Louis, were to basically submit to him. They would be given territory, but basically they were to submit to their brother. Well, they didn't much like that, quite frankly. And then the situation is complicated when in the late 820s, Louis the Pious attempts to carve out some territory for his son Charles. That complicates things further. So in a sense, Lothar felt aggrieved. He felt his succession to the imperial office was less valuable, less meaningful than it might have been. In other words, if one tries to look at it through his eyes. Now, does this justify that he rises up twice against his father? And in 833, it's Amedard de Soissons, that he attempts actually to depose his father, to remove him from office, and pack him off to a monastery. That's more difficult to say. Now, there were writers at the time. So again, we have a lot of treatises. We have a lot of letter collections. Information is going back and forth among all kinds of different Carolingian writers. There were some who felt that Louis the Pious had indeed violated the Ordinatio Imperii, that what he had done was wrong, that he should never have given land to Charles, that he didn't support Lothar sufficiently. There were others who felt that Lothar was simply disloyal, that he was angry about things he had no reason to be angry about. So contemporaries had very divided opinions on exactly what was going on. So after 834, Lothar is sent off to Italy, and actually he and his people in Italy they actually do a lot of damage down there. They raid churches and monasteries, and he sort of can't control all of his guys. Well, part of what is going on there is that the Carolingian world was a great pot of resources. Now, most of those resources involved land, but a great deal of that land was in the hand of churches. So if you had, for example, if say Louis the German, one of Louis' sons, if Pippin of Aquitaine, one of Louis' sons, or Lothar for that matter, is given a territory that has a lot of bishoprics and a lot of monasteries in it, that's a lot of wealth. And they can draw upon that wealth. Now, if Louis keeps carving up the realm, then people are going to lose out. They're going to lose wealth. That's part of what happens at the time of the Treaty of Verdun in 843. They have to, they send these kind of investigators all around the realm to size up the value of everything and then try to divide it as equally as they can. So Lothar had some grievance that he was being deprived of wealth. Then, when after 834, after the second of the rebellions against his father, he's sent off to Italy and told to stay there, he and his people behave rather badly, but what they're trying to do is capture resources in Italy that they have now been denied in the northern part of the Frankish world. So, to make a long story short, I don't find myself, Lothar, a particularly attractive character, but I think I can understand, in a way, his
Mm.
grievances.
Now, I want to begin, of course, with Louis' upbringing. Was it asserted from the start that Louis would be the sole heir for the Empire of Charlemagne, and was there a lot of expectations coming from the great Charlemagne that Louis had to live up to? As we know, with some rulers that have been nicknamed the Great, there are, of course, a lot of expectations from their sons, and of course, in some cases, as with Peter the Great, there has been a lot of disappointment with his heirs. And was there ever such expectations for Louis that and let's talk about his upbringing, and I want to mention as well, just to mention, I do believe Hegel and the Astronomer mentioned the siege on Barcelona as well, which I want to talk about. And let's talk about the upbringing of Louis, and of course
Well,
we get to Barcelona as well.
it's a wonderful question. So Louis is born in 778. In 781, he is in Rome with his father, and he and his brothers are baptized, and Louis is made king of Aquitaine. His brother Pippin is made king of Italy. So Charlemagne clearly was attempting to create, in a way, we might say a kind of a job, but really a sort of a status position. But let's remember, when Louis is sent to Aquitaine as king, he's 3 years old. So Charlemagne sends a number of his old trusted courtiers down there to kind of train Louis on the one hand, and to kind of keep an eye on him on the other hand. So he grows up down there in Aquitaine. Now, Aquitaine, and you mentioned the siege of Barcelona, but of course, Aquitaine is highly contested territory. Um, Raiders from Spain had crossed into Gaul in the 730s, and there had been cross-border raids going on for a very
Mm.
long time. And of course, Charlemagne had his campaign in
And of
770.
course, if I may interrupt you, the famous
Sure.
Battle of Tours as well, as we have that with Charles Martel, as you mentioned earlier. So we have several things going on there.
Well, no, that's right. So uh, Charlemagne goes into Spain in 778.
Mm.
Um, uh, Again, in an attempt, I think, to sort of seal that border, to stop the raiding coming over the border. And, that's the event that is recounted in the royal annals, but it's recorded also in Einhard, where sort of Basque kind of terrorists up in the Pyrenees attack Charlemagne's baggage train. So there had been trouble in that part of the world for a long time. So from one point of view, Louis actually got a lot of practical experience. Um, his brother Pippin, for example, had some military experience up in the northeast along the Avar frontier. So
Mm.
really up along the Danube frontier, so to the northeast of Italy. But on the whole, Louis had a lot of practical experience in the south. And we know that he had four main palaces, and that he rotated among these palaces where he held court and um, conducted trials and consulted with his aristocrats. But it's important to remember that at Charlemagne's court, it appears that Pippin was always kind of regarded as the heir apparent. Now, one might ask, what about Charles, the oldest of the three sons? Well, my old friend Johannes Fried thinks Charles was gay, and that he wasn't liked because of
Mm.
that, and that he wasn't going to have any children, and that he'd been kind of shuffled off to one side. It is very interesting that right through the reign of Charlemagne, we can almost never find his son Charles doing anything. Um, so for whatever reason, so as I say, generally scholars have assumed that Pippin was the heir apparent, and then in 810 and 811, Charles and Pippin died. Boom. Now it's Louis. And the evidence, again, and some of this is in the biographies, but some of it is also in annals and other sources, there was apparently some controversy over whether to invite Louis to court to make him emperor or not. And in the end, of course, it was decided to bring him to court, and and he was named emperor by his father. And of course, then the whole ceremony by which he's made emperor, he comes into church, there's a crown sitting on the altar. Charlemagne makes this long speech, and then he tells Louis to pick up the crown and put it on his own head. In other words, there's no clergy here, there's no pope here. This is not
Mm.
like Charles's coronation in Rome in Christmas of 800. So um, I mean, it's an interesting question. What exactly, what experience Louis had, what training he had. I mean, he did lots of the kinds of things that one would sort of expect a Carolingian king to do. But as I said, I don't think, and I think this is a pretty much a majority opinion, that he was regarded as the heir apparent. His brother Pippin was, with the question of his brother Charles just kind of left on the margin. I mean, it's really impossible to know what Charlemagne thought about his son Charles. Although, I mean, he did in the Divisio Imperii of 806, he did carve out a sub kingdom for Charles, but whether that would have meant that he would have somehow eventually been named emperor, well, that's anybody's guess. No document says so. So Louis was probably as or more experienced than
Both
anyone else who became.
military and in court he was as well
That's right.
experienced.
And you remember, I mean, he goes to Aquitaine in 781, and he becomes emperor in 814.
Mm,
So that's 33 years during
mm.
which he is fighting campaigns and holding courts and so forth. So I mean, you've read the biographies. We don't have a great deal of fine-grained detail about exactly what Louis was doing all this time, but he's got 33 years of experience, which is pretty impressive.
Mm. But was it common at that time to wait that long before you took over a rule in the kingdom that you had 30 years experience? Or how early what was the average lifespan? And I mean, I'm not talking about average peasant, but for kings and nobles who lived a little better, what was the average lifespan? Was this normal a rate in the medieval era?
Well, I mean, be perfectly honest, I don't know. We know the birth and death dates of most medieval kings, so it wouldn't be too difficult to just make
Mm,
a chart, make a table, and put down when they were born, when they died, and when they succeeded to rule. Um, uh, Louis, Charlemagne is probably born in 748, so he's about 20 when his father dies. Charles the Bald is born about 827. He's about 13 when his father dies. Um, uh, Louis the Pious's sons were all born around, apart from Charles, were born around 800. So when Charles died, they were sort of teenagers or a little less. When Louis died, they were, well, by then Pippin of Aquitaine had died, Lothar was still alive, and Louis the German was still alive. And they were men in their 40s. So,
mm,
I mean, as I said, I've never sat down and computed
mm.
birth dates, death dates, and date of succeeding to rule. I'm pretty confident, though, that Louis' 33 years is a pretty long period. I doubt in most cases it was that long, but it's important to say that there was no rule about this
Yeah.
because basically the reigning guy had to die. And
Mm.
then the next one comes along. So there wasn't any rule that said 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, something like that. So um, everything depended in a way on chance.
Let's talk about the death of Charlemagne because I believe if I sorry if I mix up, but Notker do speak about some bad omens happening, and I do think he's one of the least reliable, as you mentioned in the book, of the sources on Charlemagne. So but Notker mentions some signs of bad omen at Comet, I believe, among other things are surrounding Charlemagnes that were kind of foretold that he was something bad was going to happen to him, and that's of course he would then have been dead.
There were, I mean, there are things, of course, in the biographies of Louis the Pious, but there are a bunch of other sources too that have, visions and dreams and so on that people are having. Some of this is happening at the monastery of St. Gall, for example. Things are happening in various places that somebody sees Charlemagne in hell with devils gnawing on his genitals because he was promiscuous, and others, he's having gold poured into his mouth because he was so greedy. Now, um, again, there's a number of ways. I published an article some years ago on all of that stuff. Um, um, there's a number of ways to read it. Were people trying to criticize Charlemagne, or were people trying to improve the reputation of Louis the Pious? Say, well, he's not really so bad. His father did all these bad things. Um, you know, none of the authors of any of these accounts of Charlemagne's sort of after death experiences bothered to say, "I'm going to write this down, and here's why."
Mm.
So we're pretty much free to try to imagine why they said what they said. And as I said, I mean, they could be uh, criticizing Charlemagne, they could be trying to support Louis the Pious, or both. Um,
So I want to talk a little bit about the nickname to Louis as well, the Pious. How did it come to get the nickname Louis
well,
the
he doesn't really
Pious?
have that nickname before the High Middle Ages. I think really until like the 12th century. And it's interesting in older French scholarship, if you look for say 19th century books on Louis, he's Louis le Debonair, which is kind of
Mm.
curious. Um, um, he I mean, in the scholarship, he's always Louis the Pious, Louis de Frama, Louis le Pieux. But that name doesn't really attach to him until some of the literary cycles of the 12th century. And in a sense, people are looking back at him because he was so supportive of the church. There is that passage that says that, at one point he contemplated becoming a monk. I don't I don't know if I believe that that's true, but so people could look back at some of these Carolingian writings and think of Louis as very pious.
Mm.
Now, I mean, was he really, or was he, uh, on the whole, a pretty practical person, um, um, and somebody who, overall tried to do the right thing? Now, he sometimes sort of put his foot wrong, but um, I don't think it gets us very far to say, well, Louis was just really pious.
Mm.
I
So
don't.
so he didn't have that nickname during his lifetime. It was given after his
Yeah.
death.
Yes, I don't. I can't think of. Well, I mean, you saw those biographies. None of them calls him
Mm.
Louis the Pious. I can't think of right now. I can't think of a Carolingian text that calls him Louis the Pious. Ludovicus Pius. Um, that I'm pretty confident comes in the 12th century, and it comes in literature.
And it takes off, as you know, it's what is known as today, and of course Louis the First, among other names. So, but I want to talk about as well. I want to compare Charlemagne's court versus Louis the Pious court, because as you know, in Charlemagne's court you had envoys and you had people from Baghdad coming into the court, and you have people from Ireland as far as and England, and there are several ethnicities in the court of Charlemagne. Was it similar and in Louis the Pious court, or was it totally different animal?
It is rather different. Um, Many of the people you were just mentioning who show up at Charlemagne's court are scholars that
Mm.
he attracted to court because he thought they had something particular to contribute to his educational reforms, to his ecclesiastical reforms. Um, by Lewis's time, a great many of those reforms were pretty well launched. But Louis, and this is part of what got him in trouble with some people, Louis brought a considerable number of people with him to court from Aquitaine. And a considerable number of people from the north sort of probably had their nose out of joint because they thought that preferments that should have gone to them were going to these other people. So when we go back to Charlemagne's court, it's important to say that when we can identify chief secular officials working in this court, they are not, they're Franks. They are not these Irishmen and Anglo-Saxons and Italians and everybody else. Yes, he's bringing those people to his court, but even there, and I don't have it with me now, but I had a table that I used to put up on the screen when I taught this for my students, and it had a whole bunch of the names of these outside scholars who came to court, and then the years we knew they were at the court. There were never very many of them there at the same time. They didn't overlap very much. So it isn't as if Charlemagne's court was just absolutely bustling with all these foreign scholars. There were lots of them who were there at different times, and that's important. But it's also important that they were not, for the most part, getting major jobs, as it were, in the Carolingian administration. So when Louis comes along, he's bringing people with him from Aquitaine, not least, for example, the infamous Bernard of Septimania, who causes all kinds of trouble. But Benedict of Agnan, for example, who kind of leads the ecclesiastical reforms of 816, 817. He's Aquitanian. Actually, he comes from Maguelone. He comes from Gothia. He comes from south of Aquitaine, but he's another southerner who comes north. Elizaker, who's Louis' chancellor, is a southerner, an Aquitaine guy. So he brings a lot of these people north with him. So that is rather different. But then going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, he has spent years with these people. He knows them. For the most part, he trusts them. He doesn't know the people at his father's court. Louis was almost never at his father's court, which is, sort of interesting and in some ways kind of puzzling. Why was he basically never there? I mean, when Charlemagne goes down, for example, to Italy on a momentous journey in the autumn of the year 800, he doesn't take Louis with him. Now, he had to go right through Aquitaine to go on down to Italy, but he didn't take Louis to Italy with him. Why not? Well, I mean, I don't know, but it's interesting that Louis would not have been well known to the people at the heart of Charlemagne's administration. And then when Louis comes north with all his Aquitanian friends, those people were not known to the people who had been leaders in the previous regime.
Now, of course, so next I wanted to bring up, we spoke about the siege of Barcelona against a person named Saldo, and I wanted to speak a little bit about Louis' campaigns for a while as well. So I want to begin, of course, because during his rule in Aquitaine, he of course fights against Barcelona, as mentioned in both two sources, an Astronomer and forgive me, I'm a little bit poor with remembering, but let's try the Hedegart. Yeah. So it mentioned the two sources that mentioned the siege of Barcelona, and let's begin with talk about this campaign for a little while and begin with the siege of Barcelona as well, because they seem rather that there's some interesting. It's interesting to read about this, especially in the primary sources when you read about the siege.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's not too much to say beyond what the sources tell us. Louis leads a pretty massive campaign. His father had gone down to Zaragoza, and then basically came back north. And Louis, I think, has basically recognized that that Barcelona is the key to controlling this whole territory in the south. One of the interesting things about that territory in the south that's worth always keeping in mind is that we tend to think of the Pyrenees as forming this boundary between the Frankish world and the Spanish world, or the Visigothic world before that, or the Muslim world. And actually, there's a territory from the Ebro River to the to the Loire River. No, I'm sorry, to the Garonne, from the Ebro to the Garonne, which is a pretty coherent territory. The Occitan language, for example, is very much like Catalan. If you travel in that part of the world today, the food is very much the same. I mean, this is an area that has a kind of an internal coherence, and it's in that area that the Franks had been subject to sort of constant trouble. So what I think Louis recognizes, and I think it was a prudent and well thought through decision, is that Barcelona was the key to gaining control of that much larger territory. So he goes on to Barcelona. And what he realizes is that Barcelona, one of the interesting things, the way the biographers talk about it, I mean, Barcelona was a very well fortified city. And so Louis has to realize that a siege of this city is going to be a very considerable undertaking. And he basically plans to stay as long as he needs to stay to get the job done. And so he does. Now, we have all those wonderful little set pieces. The battles where one of the Muslims and one of the Franks kind of yell at each other back and forth and so forth.
There's one conversation I found interesting in particular that I don't remember which one wrote this, but he says supposedly that to the Saldo, one of the main generals, I think, in the city, that is, you see this horse, we will kill this horse, we will never give up, we will never withdraw, we will kill our horses and eat them before we surrender and give up the siege of your city, or something in the line of that. And that tells you something about the Carolingian spirit as well. Of course, we don't know if that happened, but if it really said so. But it tells you something, like I said, about the spirit of the Carolingian warriors.
Sure, no, I think that's just right. But it's also true that these authors were pretty well read. And now they had no Greek, so they had never read the Iliad and the Odyssey, but they'd read Virgil, and they'd read other Roman sources. And one of the interesting things about dying in antiquity is that if you're on the battlefield, you die for 100 lines. It's never like just boom, you die, boom, you fall down, you're dead, and the story moves on. So somebody gives a long speech and then they die, or they give a long speech and then they kill somebody. And so these set pieces, there's absolutely no reason to take any of them literally. One can go back and
I had to mention that the long set piece before he kills someone kind of sounds like a supervillain today would say before he reveals his master plan and before he's taken down that, this is what I'm gonna do, and then he boom, either fails or do something surprising and do exactly what he's supposed to say. So it kind of reminds me a little bit about, what a villain in a superhero movie or in a James Bond movie does. Like,
sure, and now obviously none of these people had ever read Thucydides, but the central point of Thucydides' history was that he reported speeches as what people would have said in the circumstances. And that becomes a literary trope right through antiquity and into the early Middle Ages. You can make up speeches that you believe convey what somebody in that moment, in that place, would have said. And we can see the authors. Hermoldus is particularly good at that, but we can see it to some extent in the Astronomer also. So basically making up these speeches. Now, I think that what the authors are trying to convey, they're trying to convey a very positive image of Louis. They are trying to praise Frankish spirit, Frankish courage, their willingness to undertake this great siege. And there are lots of interesting little details. you know, the Muslim scouts who find dung floating down the river and said, "Uh-oh, we're in trouble," because
Mm.
they realize that that some pretty important animals have been passing across that river. You know, I mean, little details like that help to enliven the story. They don't really move it along very far. I mean, that didn't end the siege or something, but it is interesting that the authors would choose to include sort of little details like that. Um, but anyway, it's the siege of Barcelona is really quite an impressive set piece um, in the stories.
Now that is obviously one of the most famous campaigns, I think, of Louis the Pious' reign and life. But while the other campaign, of course, it wasn't the only one. So let's talk about some of the other campaigns that he embarked on as well. But I think that, to my remembrance, it's the only one mentioned in the primary source. But were there other sieges and campaigns as well that he embarks on?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of sort of answers to that question. I'll come to the most important one in just a second. Um, Louis, um, so we have, in a way, we have to back up to the time of Charles Martel and even indeed to the time of
Mm.
Charlemagne. And do we regard them, and say in particular, do we regard Charlemagne as a great conqueror, or was he basically trying to recover the territories that had once been claimed by their Merovingian predecessors? So in central Germany and southern Germany, for example, that appears to be the case. It's not so much that Charlemagne went into new territory. When Charlemagne and Louis go down to Italy and go down to Rome, they do everything in their power, you sort of not to conquer Rome. They keep their hands off. Charlemagne's campaigns in Saxony, the sources make it pretty clear that this was something Charlemagne felt was forced upon him, that the Saxons kept raiding, and that he's got to stop this. And you can watch how he moves forward over decade by decade. He moves up to one river, there's still raids. He moves up to another river, there's some raids. He moves finally all the way up to the Eiderschlei line in southern Denmark. But he doesn't sort of start right off and conquer Saxony. It happens slowly. So what Louis did is agents of his. Louis did not. You know, Charlemagne participated in 53 campaigns in the 46 years of his reign. Louis participated in very few campaigns as emperor. Now he has the great campaign in the south when he's king of Aquitaine, but as
Mm.
emperor, he has very few campaigns. But he does have people fighting on his behalf in the east, basically trying to preserve, in a sense, the frontier over there. Okay, so that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is Brittany. So uh,
Yeah,
the
yeah. The
Britons,
Carolingian writers aren't very fond of the Britons, are they?
yeah, well, of course, I mean, the Bretons had been driving the Merovingian kings crazy,
Mm.
and they were driving the Carolingian kings crazy. They were supposed to be loyal. They were supposed to have submitted. They wouldn't submit. They wouldn't, they wouldn't sort of pay their taxes. Um, they gave the Frankish Church all kinds of trouble about appointing bishops and things like that. And so Louis basically wants to subject Brittany to sort of put an end to this. Now, I think
That did, if I'm sorry for interrupting you, but there did
yeah,
seem to be a decent under Charlemagne with the king of Offa in England. There did seem to be some kind of relationship there because there seemed to be the Carolingian, as we mentioned, they don't like the Bretons, but with the marriage there was we talked about marriage proposal. I don't know if I don't remember if it was Offa's daughter with
oh,
Charlemagne's son,
so
but
Bretons are
yeah.
the people who live in the Armorican Peninsula
Oh,
in France.
right, right.
Britons live in England.
Oh, right. No, no,
So
I was thinking. Yeah,
so
that's my mistake. Yeah.
two
No,
completely
no.
different.
For some reason, it sounded like it was Britons and
So
Bretons, but
Bretons and Britons.
yeah, some similar. So it was my mistake. I'm sorry for screwing that up right
No,
there. But
no,
yeah,
that's all right.
it was my mistake.
So Louis wants to subject Brittany,
Yeah.
and my own view of that is that his attitude with respect to Brittany is very much like his attitude with respect to Catalonia or to Barcelona. We've got a problem here. Let's go in there and solve this problem. let's put an end to all this trouble out here. Now, in some ways, I think this was also his father's policy in Italy in 773-4, when Charlemagne goes in, defeats Desiderius, sends him off to a monastery, and puts an end to the Lombard monarchy. I think that Charlemagne had said, look, these people gave my father fits for 20 years. They've been giving me trouble. I'm simply not going to put up with this anymore. I'm going in and put an end to the problem. So Louis, I think, with the Barcelona campaign, is effectively saying, I'm going in there and put an end to this problem. With the Breton campaign, he thinks, I'm going to go in there and put an end to this problem. However, what he didn't reckon on is the Bretons wouldn't play fair. They were basically guerrilla warriors. The Frankish army would go in, they would never fight a pitched battle. They got attacked all over the place. And the Franks also discovered that Brittany was very poor. So when you went in there, your opportunities for plunder were small. So in the 820s, part of what really began to turn a significant segment of the Frankish aristocracy against Louis were those Breton campaigns, because they thought, these campaigns are dangerous and they're not lucrative. We don't get anything out of this deal, and that really, I think, began to damage. That problem is contemporaneous with the birth of Charles the Bald, the attempt to create new territory for him. So all of these problems kind of culminate in the middle and late years of the 820s. But the Breton campaign was really a catastrophe for Louis.
Another problem that seemed to occur under Louis the Pious is, of course, the emergence of the Vikings. So how did they deal with these problems? And there is mention of a Harald in Danish king called Harald, and I might be wrong again here, but is this Harald Bluetooth he's referring to, or is it a different
No,
Harald?
Bluetooth is a lot later.
Yeah.
This is Harold Klak,
Mm.
Klak, Harold Klak. But this is another interesting reflection on Charlemagne. In the last years of Charlemagne's reign, beginning about 810, he attempts to forge alliances in Denmark. In other words, he doesn't gather up his army and march into Denmark. He doesn't care about conquering Denmark. What he wants up there is peace. He wants peace on that northern frontier. So he tries to achieve peace with the Danish kings. Louis continues that policy. And then we have that long set piece in Ermoldus where he brings Harold Klak to court, and he has great banquets for him, and he has a great hunting expedition for him, and he's given all these presents and so forth. And all of these Vikings come down, and they're dressed in white garments, and they're baptized, and so on. So then what happens is Harold goes back, and there's very complicated politics inside Denmark. Harold winds up getting killed, and other factions of Danes sort of continue the raiding across the northern part of the Frankish world. Now, the raiding intensified in the 830s, but it really picked up steam in the 840s when the Scandinavians in general, I mean, basically Norwegians and Danes, the Swedes were a little bit later, they're going east. They can look at the Frankish world and realize the Frankish world is in full civil war. Louis the Pious's sons are fighting a civil war amongst each other. Everything is terribly divided. This makes it a very ripe target. And they start to attack, and attack. And as you know, it takes a very long time. I mean, one could say, in some ways, the raids sort of ran out of gas. They never really stopped them. They tried to fortify bridges on the River Seine, for example. That didn't work. They tried all kinds of things, but it didn't. There was really nothing they could do to stop these. In part because neither Denmark nor Norway was as yet anything like a unified kingdom. So there were all these different groups of Vikings following various leaders, and they were all going off and different directions. Some of them were raiding down the river Seine, for example. Some were raiding down the river Loire, for example. Some were raiding down the Weser and the Elbe in northern Germany, for example. So in part, you never knew where these guys were coming from. You never knew when they were going to show up. You didn't know which bands you were dealing with. There was nobody to negotiate with. Now, I think, as I said, I think Charles and Louis thought maybe they had an opportunity to negotiate with Danish kings, but it proved that those Danish kings didn't have very much authority, and that simply didn't work. So now the I mean, as you probably know, there's all kinds of theories about what prompted what we call Viking activity. Why did this happen? I remember Michael Wallace Hadriel's famous remark that we have to be careful not to regard them as simply long-haired foreigners who sometimes roughed up or long-haired tourists who sometimes roughed up the natives. I mean, these guys can be pretty violent and nasty.
Mm.
So they hit monasteries, for example. Well, why not? I mean, they're
Easy
not defended,
targets.
and they got a lot of wealthy stuff. I mean, if you're raiding, this is a good place. Now there have been all these different, arguments over the years about, is Muslim silver coming up across the Baltic and into the North Sea, and then does that get cut off, and therefore does trade that had existed in the 8th century not exist any longer, and basically people in the north are trying to sort of recover their economic position. In other words, was there method to the Vikings' madness? In other words, these guys were not simply violent guys who just said, "Let's get in a boat, go kill people." I mean, they had objectives. Now, the objectives were largely to enrich themselves, but that's understandable. So,
I mean, there is some scholars, I think, who theorize that poverty, of course, in Scandinavia was big at the time, and that's one of the reasons that they went out on this trade to, and like you said, enrich themselves, but also because of back home to get, to get the poverty, because the poverty was so big back home they didn't really have any choice. Then, and as I mentioned, the trade may have stopped, so that might be a reason. So there, yeah, and I guess that poverty could be one of the
and
biggest reasons,
as you
perhaps.
probably know, there has been an argument. It's kind of rises and falls and rises and falls, that there may have been overpopulation in Scandinavia,
Mm,
and that the available land resources were not great enough for the population. Then other people will say, well, no, the archaeology doesn't really show us overpopulation. And then people come back and say, well, maybe it does. So I don't have a horse in that race. So I can't,
mm.
I'm not an archaeologist, and I don't follow all that literature, but I know that issue has been raised in the past, that it might have been some kind of overpopulation in Scandinavia that sort of pushed people out. Um, I suppose that's possible.
Mm. So let's talk about the end, and we mentioned this in the beginning of the episode, the carve up that Louis did for his son. Was it a bad idea from the start, carving up the empire for his several sons, as we know what happened after his death? And let's talk about how succession after Louis. Was there a succession plan like Charlemagne may have had, or was it a bit more troublesome for Louis than it was for
Well,
Charlemagne?
was it a good idea? One
It
of
doesn't
the
sound like it was when coming judging from what happened after his death. Didn't sound like a good idea at the time.
one of the interesting things about historical study, of course, is that hindsight is always 2020.
Mm,
Our hindsight is always perfect. But when we imagine people living in the contingency of the moment, they have to make decisions on the spot. Now, in Merovingian times, Frankish kings divided their realm among their sons. Charles Martel divided his realm between Pippin and Carloman. Carloman in 747 goes away to Monte Cassino and becomes a monk. Pippin divided his realm between Charles and Carloman, his two sons. In 3 years, his second son, Charles was the older of the two, his second son dies. So the point is that dividing the realm up was Frankish custom, was Frankish practice. That's what you did. In 806, Charles issues the Divisio Imperii, which is a long and very complicated document where he divided his realm up among Charles, Pippin, and Louis. And he, as I was saying a little while ago, exactly what he might have had in mind for his son Charles is anybody's guess. And as I suggested, I think Charlemagne regarded Pippin as his heir apparent, but I can't prove that. But anyway, what Charlemagne would not necessarily have anticipated is that in 810 and 811, Charles and Pippin would die. Okay, now he's got one heir. This is unusual in the Frankish world. So when Louis in 817 issues his Ordinatio Imperii, he divides the realm among his first three sons, Louis, Pippin, Lothar. That was normal. Now, what happens then is that he has a fourth son. From one point of view, you could say, well, no problem. You just give him some territory. And basically, what Louis tried to do was carve out some territory in the upper Rhone Valley, kind of in Burgundy and sort of in that particular zone. So it would have actually, so his son Louis is over in Bavaria. His son Pippin is in Aquitaine following him, and his son Lothar more or less has the north and has the imperial title. So the territory he was giving to Charles, I'm sorry, yes, to Charles, was not the choicest territory in the Frankish world, but the point is it would have belonged to the other brothers. So, as I say, from one point of view, what he's doing is perfectly normal, perfectly traditional. From another point of view, the first three brothers are jealous. Now, they also worry that his new wife, Judith, is too influential at the court, that she has Louis's ear. She's talking him into things that others don't like. And then we have these crazy stories that she's even
So
having.
she's kind of, if I may add, she's kind of Livia of the Carolingian world in I Claudius, in a sense. She's kind of the Livia for manipulating from behind the scenes.
Sure. And then there are the stories that appear in the biographies that Judith is having an affair with Bernard of Septimania. I can't prove yay or nay on that particular point, but I think it's just the kind of salacious charge that is made to try to discredit Judith. So, from one point of view, dividing the realm among his sons was perfectly normal Carolingian practice. Now, it's worth keeping in mind that in the next generation, his son Pippin is dead. Louis the German divides the realm eventually among his three sons. Charles the Bald divides the realm among his sons. Lothar has his son Lothar II in what we now call Lorraine, Lotharingia, and Charles down in Provence, and then and eventually Louis II in Italy. So Lothar divided things up among his sons, and in each succeeding generation, they kept dividing things up. So, when we say, well, was it a good idea that Louis did this? He simply did what Carolingian kings do.
Mm-hmm.
There's not much more to it than that. Now, should he not have got married a second time? Should he have not had another child? It's interesting, isn't it, to play what if? What if this? What if this? What if this? But he does get married again, and he does have another child, and excuse me, and so he attempts to create some sort of an endowment for that child, Charles, and that coming close on the heels of these disastrous Breton campaigns, and all of a sudden Louis in big trouble.
Now, would you say that, as I mentioned earlier, it seems that many consider this as the beginning of the fall of the Charlemagne's empire? Would you agree that this is the case, this would be at the end of Louis' life, that this would be the beginning of the end of Charlemagne's empire?
Well, the strict answer to your question has to be yes. But it's also important to kind of keep in mind that the Frankish world was unified exactly once, under Charlemagne to be sure, but it was never unified like that under Charlemagne's father and grandfather. It was never unified like that among the Merovingian kings, and it would never be unified again after that. So it's sort of, if we look at Charlemagne's reign, in a way, it is not the model or the standard against which we should judge everything. What we have to do is look at that reign as unusual. Now, that's one part of the answer. A second part of the answer is, if we read through theological treatises and letters and so forth, and even if we look at the Divisio Imperii from 806 and the Ordinatio Imperii from 817, a very considerable effort was being made to describe the Populus Christianus living in the Imperium Christianum. They're trying to imagine this empire as a single unity that can have many rulers. Now, was that possible in practice? As we know, no, it wasn't. But there were a great many good and serious thinkers who tried to imagine the Carolingian realm as this single unified Christian empire. And for them, in a way, it didn't matter who the rulers were. What mattered was this ideological, this ecclesiological proposition that there was a single empire. And German scholars used to talk about the Unteilbarkeit des Reiches, the inseparability of the empire. And they didn't mean that the empire wasn't separated, because of course it was. It was carved up and carved up and carved up over a long period of time, but that the concept existed that the empire would not be, would not collapse, would not fall. So we have a kind of a disjunction between what actually happened and some of the best thinking in that period.
Would you say that the empire was in disarray all the way up until Otto the Great, who is well known for revival of the Holy Roman Empire? It wasn't known as the Holy Roman Empire at the time, of course. We discussed this with Peter Wilson a few years ago. But what was Otto? Was it in disarray until Otto the Great came to recreate the Holy Roman Empire?
Well, again, that's a very interesting question. After the Treaty of Verdun, 843, the West Frankish and East Frankish kingdoms are united very briefly under Charles the Fat between 885 and 888. But otherwise, those realms are never again unified. They're never one single realm again. Now, for a lot of reasons, internal politics, Viking raids, competence of rulers, it took the West Frankish kingdom a lot longer to sort of get itself organized, to get effective kings, and so on. In the East, pretty quickly, the Ottonian house managed. Now, they had some luck, didn't they? They came from Saxony, a very important part of Germany, and they had the silver mines. They had an enormous financial resource. And they were also exceptionally competent military leaders. So, for example, defeating the Magyars at the Lechfeld in 955. So it was a combination of things: the resources of Saxony, the resources of the silver mines, also the church. Now, think back to what I was saying a moment ago about the idea that churchmen thought of the realm as a unitary entity, almost independent of who is ruling it. German rulers, German churchmen, German bishops supported the Ottonians. They wanted a strong kingdom because they saw a strong kingdom as protection for themselves. Now, we can then get into the whole business of the imperial church, and did the three Ottos have too much control of that church, and so forth. That's kind of a story for another
That's
day.
another episode.
But Otto is indeed a very, very interesting person. Now, when he goes into Italy in 962, and he's crowned emperor, what exactly was his objective? Now, I think the safest answer is that if he goes into Italy and becomes emperor, he is able to tax Italians and particularly northern Italian cities and to generate revenue that he cannot generate in Germany. His Otto I, Otto II, Otto III, their relations with the other great German dukes, Swabia, Bavaria, Franconia, are often tenuous, are often very difficult. So, in a sense, what you have to do is out resource these guys. And what do resources add up to? The ability to attract followers. The more resources you have. So, was Otto's Italian policy a German policy? Now, if we go back, do the names of Sybil and Vicar mean anything to you? They
I
were
heard
two
names, but
they were two enormously important German historians in the 19th century. And one of them argues that the Ottonian policy in Italy was a German policy and it made perfect sense. The other one argues is the Italian policy of the Ottonians destroyed Germany and kept it disunited until the 19th century. So, so there were these two completely different historiographical views of what, what Otto was doing. Otto is it's completely unlike Pope Stephen II traveling over the Alps in the dead of winter to go see Pippin to get help against the Lombards. What happened in the 8th century is a completely different thing from what was happening in the 10th. So, well, if you can get somebody to come on and talk to you about Otto the First, that would be very interesting.
But it seems that Otto I is credited with the revival of the Holy Roman Empire. That he seems to revive the Charlemagnes Empire. It's my understanding.
Well, you can say that, but you have to keep in mind that essentially what the Ottonian rulers ruled was basically what we would today call Germany.
Hmm.
All of the Frankish realms, all of the West Frankish realm, everything we would today call France, not to mention also the Netherlands and Belgium and what have you, the Ottonians never controlled any of that. Now they did actually march armies in there once or twice to kind of stick their nose in other people's business, but they never controlled all that. So they never unified Charlemagne's empire. Now, did they have in mind recapturing something of what Charlemagne had accomplished? I think the answer is yes. I think they were deeply aware of Charlemagne. They visited his tomb in Aachen, and there are all these interesting accounts of Otto going to Charlemagne's tomb in Aachen and so forth. But also, just on a very technical point, Holy Roman Empire is a technical term that became the name of an institution in the 14th century.
But they were
The
not a Holy
German
Roman.
Empire was never the Holy Roman Empire. People call it that all the time, but that wasn't what it was. Now, it is true that in the time of Frederick Barbarossa, a German writer spoke of the Sacrum Imperium Romanum, Holy Roman Empire. But he was simply trying to make the point that Frederick was put in office by God, and therefore his empire was sacred, and all these other German dukes and things, and also the church, and also the Pope should leave him alone. But it was never the technical name for anything. But later on, in the time of Charles V, it is actually the formal name of that institution. But I mean, Otto does recreate an empire. He is crowned emperor. But it's when I was teaching and so forth, I always just called it the German Empire because it I mean, to call it the Roman Empire, if you think about it, it beg a lot of questions. So hang on, the Roman Empire went from Hadrian's Wall in the north of England to Mesopotamia. I mean, Otto didn't have any of that. So as I said, I used to always just call it the German Empire.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I think we're gonna round it up there. Hopefully, you got a decent account of Louis the Pious. And of course, if you want to read more, I would highly recommend reading about Charlemagne and Louis in these primary sources that you can find translated and written by Thomas Noble, as we had spoken about here. And of course, if they do want to read more about Louis and Charlemagne, where can people find this book? And do you have any social media or anything you want me to share
It's
in the
easy.
description below?
Find it on Amazon. Easiest place
Th-
probably to find it is Amazon.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on. My name is Alan. This has been Without H12. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, rate us 5 stars. That would be very great. If you're on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review of us. That would be great. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribes. My name is Alan, and I will see you next time.